The story you're about to hear does not belong to the comfortable pages of school textbooks or glossy war documentaries. It comes instead from the sealed boxes of forgotten archives, the censored lines of intelligence briefings, and the shredded fragments of reports governments never wanted the public to see. Under the cold heading, 4. War mysteries governments tried to erase from history, lies a record of silence, erasure, and betrayal. These are not myths or rumors, but documented shadows, cross-referenced through declassified memoranda, captured interrogations, and the whispers of survivors who were told never to speak. As the world celebrated victory in 1945, secret files were quietly locked away. Deals were struck in smoke-filled rooms. Trainloads of the condemned were sent into the night, and massacres were buried beneath layers of denial. Nations that once spoke of justice instead chose convenience, power, or scientific advantage. These are not stories of the battlefield's roar, but of the chilling silence that followed it. The silence of erased witnesses, destroyed evidence, and rewritten history. Listen carefully, for each of these accounts carries a cost. They remain dangerous even today because truth, once unearthed, does not rest easily. What follows are 4 suppressed files, resurfacing from the shadows of the Second World War. Chapter 1. The Erased Atrocities of Unit 731. Hidden in the northern reaches of Manchukuo, in the city of Harbin, stood a facility surrounded by barbed wire and silence. Officially, it was known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. Unofficially, it carried a name that history has since whispered with dread: Unit 731. Established in 1936 under the command of General Shiro Ishii, a physician turned war criminal, the unit became the epicenter of one of the darkest experiments in modern warfare. Here, thousands of civilians, prisoners of war, and dissidents were reduced to nothing more than living test material. They were referred to in records by the code word Maruta, meaning logs. The language was deliberate, stripping them of humanity, making it easier for the men in white coats to justify what followed. From its inception, Unit 731 operated with a level of secrecy that even the highest ranks of the Japanese Imperial Army struggled to fully comprehend. High concrete walls shielded its laboratories. Access was tightly controlled. Files marked with red seals were carried in locked briefcases across military checkpoints. Inside, Ishii's men carried out their orders with ruthless precision. Frostbite experiments subjected prisoners to temperatures as low as -40 degrees Celsius. Limbs were deliberately exposed until they froze solid, then struck with blunt instruments to observe whether they shattered like wood. Other victims were sealed inside pressure chambers until their eyes ruptured from decompression. Still others were injected with pathogens, plague, anthrax, cholera, to monitor the slow, agonizing progress of disease. What sets Unit 731 apart from many wartime atrocities is not only the scale, but also the deliberate erasure. When the tide of the war turned against Japan, Ishii issued a directive in August 1945, destroy everything. Witnesses were executed, records were burned, buildings were demolished in a rush of dynamite and gasoline. Even so, fragments survived, a charred patient log retrieved by Soviet forces, coded transmissions intercepted by Allied intelligence, and the haunting testimony of a handful of surviving staff who were captured and interrogated in Khabarovsk by the Soviets later that year. The Khabarovsk war crimes trials, held in December 1949, revealed chilling details about the experiments. But in the West, these revelations were dismissed as propaganda, their evidence quietly shelved by governments unwilling to confront the truth. The most disturbing aspect of Unit 731's erasure is the deal struck in its aftermath. In 1947, US occupation authorities in Japan, led by General Douglas MacArthur, made a calculated decision. The Soviet Union was advancing its own biological weapons program, and Washington was desperate to gain the upper hand. Instead of prosecuting Ishii and his staff at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, US intelligence officers offered them immunity in exchange for their research data. Memo 731, classified top secret, outlined the agreement. Information on plague bombs, frostbite survival, and anthrax dispersal methods would be transferred directly to Fort Detrick in Maryland, the heart of America's biological warfare program. The scientists of Unit 731 were quietly absorbed into post-war Japan's medical and industrial elite. Ishii himself lived comfortably until his death in 1959, never facing justice for his crimes. The United States' concealment of these atrocities left behind a trail of silenced victims. Families of the dead never learned the fate of their loved ones. Japanese schoolchildren were taught for decades that Unit 731 was a fabrication, a Soviet lie meant to humiliate Japan. Only in the late 1980s and 1990s, after grassroots activists and historians uncovered abandoned sites and testimony, did the scale of the atrocities resurface. Still, government officials resisted acknowledgement. Even today, records remain classified, hidden in US archives, stamped with phrases like national security and sensitive intelligence sources. The long shadow of Unit 731 extends beyond Japan. Its research influenced Cold War biological weapons strategies. At Fort Detrick, debriefs of Ishii's men provided data on plague vectors and aerosol dispersal, knowledge considered too valuable to discard. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, expanded its own program, citing Unit 731's legacy as justification. The arms race in biological warfare was fueled not by theoretical science, but by the blood-soaked experiments of Harbin. The silence surrounding these crimes was not an accident. It was policy, carefully maintained by governments who chose advantage over accountability. Walking the ruins of Pingfang, where parts of Unit 731's complex still stand, one is struck by the emptiness. Concrete slabs sink into the earth, rusted barbed wire curls in the wind, yet beneath the soil lie the remains of thousands whose names were erased. Their suffering exists only in fragments of testimony. A guard recalling the screams muffled by laboratory walls, a nurse describing the smell of gangrene, a technician admitting to vivisections performed without anesthesia. These fragments are the only memorials to the silenced. For decades, governments tried to erase Unit 731 from the record. They succeeded in keeping it from public memory, but they failed to erase the truth entirely. It lingers in declassified files, in the shadows of Cold War research programs, and in the silence of mass graves scattered across Manchuria. The erasure was deliberate, the denial was political, but the legacy remains, festering like the very diseases Ishii unleashed in his laboratories. What was meant to be forgotten continues to haunt, a reminder that history can be buried, but it cannot be destroyed. Chapter 2: Operation Keelhaul's Disturbing Human Cargo. The final months of the Second World War produced not only liberation, but one of the most tragic betrayals in modern European history. Amid the rubble of Germany and Austria, millions of displaced persons wandered roads clogged with broken vehicles and desperate families. Among them were prisoners of war, anti-Soviet fighters, refugees from Stalin's purges, and entire communities of Cossacks who had fought first against the Bolsheviks and then, under duress or desperation, alongside German forces. To the outside world, the Allied victory was supposed to symbolize freedom and justice. But in a series of secret agreements hidden under diplomatic phrases, many of these people would be condemned to an entirely different fate. The operation that sealed their doom carried a cold, bureaucratic codename, Operation Keelhaul. The story begins at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin met on the Crimean coast to divide post-war Europe. Beneath the speeches of cooperation, hidden clauses were inserted into agreements concerning repatriation of nationals. Stalin demanded that all Soviet citizens, regardless of circumstance, be returned to his control. To maintain fragile unity with Moscow, Roosevelt and Churchill agreed. What followed was not simply repatriation, it was forced return under armed guard, often in defiance of the victims' own pleas. Thousands, who had fled Stalin's terror during the 1930s or had been captured by the Germans, were now categorized as Soviet nationals. It made no difference whether they considered themselves Russian, Ukrainian, or stateless exiles. The bureaucratic stamp of nationality became their death sentence. In May 1945, British forces in Austria began rounding up Cossack units who had surrendered under promises of fair treatment. Eyewitness reports describe entire families being herded into camps near Lienz, under the shadow of the Alps. Many believed they were being transferred to resettlement centers in Italy. Instead, at dawn, they were marched to train stations and truck convoys guarded by armed soldiers. Mothers clutched infants, officers carried religious icons, and men sang hymns as they were loaded into cattle cars. Some realized the truth too late. Diaries of British officers recount scenes of chaos, men slitting their own throats with knives, families leaping into rivers, others hurling themselves against the bayonets of guards rather than be handed to Soviet troops waiting across the border. By the summer of 1945, tens of thousands had been delivered directly into the hands of the NKVD. Few were ever seen again. Declassified Foreign Office memoranda from 1946 reveal how carefully this operation was concealed. Reports were labeled confidential, destroy after reading. Casualties were described as population transfers. No mention was made of suicides, shootings, or mass deportations. Officers who protested were silenced or reassigned. In one memorandum, British General Sir Charles Keelhaul justified the operation as a necessity of higher policy considerations, a phrase that stripped human tragedy of all emotion. American forces, though somewhat more hesitant, also participated. In Bavaria, US military police guarded camps where Soviet citizens were prepared for handover. Many wept and begged at the gates, appealing to the principles of freedom they thought America represented. Their cries were drowned out by engines of the convoys that took them east. The Soviets wasted no time. Interrogation camps awaited the returnees. Some were executed immediately, accused of treason for allowing themselves to be captured by the Germans. Others were sent to Siberian labor camps, their lives consumed in the frozen gulags of Kolyma and Vorkuta. Testimony smuggled out years later spoke of overcrowded rail transports, starvation rations, and endless interrogations designed to extract false confessions. One survivor described watching his father executed within hours of arrival, shot in the head in front of assembled prisoners as a warning. Another recalled the silence of a camp where no birds sang, only the sound of guards barking orders in the snow. Western governments worked hard to erase these events. At the Nuremberg trials, prosecutors refused to raise the issue, fearing it would expose Allied complicity. Official histories published in the late 1940s made no reference to Keelhaul. The term itself was chosen with cruel irony. In naval tradition, keelhauling was a punishment where sailors were dragged beneath a ship's hull, scraping against barnacles until they drowned or bled to death. In the bureaucratic lexicon of post-war Europe, Operation Keelhaul meant consigning human beings to Stalin's vengeance. Hidden under layers of diplomatic language, the archives remained sealed for decades. It was not until the 1970s and 1980s that fragments began to surface. Historians such as Nicholas Bethel and Alexander Solzhenitsyn exposed the outlines of the betrayal, drawing on survivor accounts and leaked documents. Parliamentary debates in Britain briefly addressed the matter, but the government denied large-scale wrongdoing. Even today, many files remain classified, their pages blacked out under national security exemptions. Officially, these people were repatriated. Unofficially, they were sacrificed to political expedience. The psychological toll on those who witnessed the handovers lingered long after the war. British soldiers who had guarded the camps wrote in their diaries of sleepless nights and crippling guilt. One described the haunting image of a Cossack officer who handed him a crucifix moments before being loaded onto a truck, saying, "Keep this safe, for I will not return." American officers privately admitted the contradiction between the ideals of liberty and the reality of forced repatriation, yet few spoke openly. Their silence was part of the broader effort to maintain the fragile facade of Allied unity as the Cold War began. The tragedy of Operation Keelhaul is not only in the lives destroyed, but in the deliberate attempt to erase the betrayal from history. Families were denied closure, official records were sanitized, and the victims were reduced to statistics buried in archives. It remains one of the most disturbing examples of governments sacrificing human beings on the altar of geopolitical necessity. The echoes of those train convoys and forced marches linger in the alpine valleys of Austria and the forests of Eastern Europe, where unmarked graves still lie hidden beneath the soil. Operation Keelhaul was not simply an episode of post-war confusion. It was a calculated decision, a betrayal carried out with precision, and then buried under decades of silence. In the cold language of official memoranda, lives became human cargo. In the reality of history, it was a crime committed not by dictators, but by the very governments that had promised freedom and justice. Chapter 3: The Forbidden Pact of Operation Paperclip. In the smouldering ruins of the Third Reich, as cities lay in ash and surrender terms were signed, another war was already beginning. It was not fought with tanks or bombers, but with intelligence files, coded cables, and the race for scientific supremacy. Its codename, chosen with bureaucratic detachment, was Operation Paperclip. To the public, the Allies celebrated the triumph of justice at Nuremberg, condemning the crimes of Nazi leaders. Yet behind closed doors, American intelligence officers were quietly recruiting some of the very same men who had built Hitler's war machine. Their dossiers were rewritten, their crimes erased, and their expertise smuggled across the Atlantic under cover of darkness. The moral contradictions were staggering, but the Cold War left little room for ethics. The United States was determined to secure German science before the Soviets could claim it. The operation formally began in 1945 under the oversight of the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, or GIOA. Its mandate was clear: identify German scientists, engineers, and technical specialists whose knowledge could serve American interests. On paper, these men were to be carefully screened for Nazi affiliations. In practice, the screening process became a formality easily bent by intelligence officers. A red paperclip was attached to files flagged for recruitment, even when incriminating evidence filled the pages. War crimes were ignored, rewritten, or expunged entirely. Scientists once hailed as loyal servants of the Reich were rebranded as neutral technicians. Their SS ranks, their involvement in forced labor, their participation in human experiments, these details disappeared beneath layers of censorship. Among the most famous recruits was Werner von Braun, the charismatic rocket engineer whose V-2 missiles had rained destruction on London and Antwerp. In underground tunnels at Mittelwerk, thousands of prisoners from concentration camps labored and died constructing those rockets. Survivors later described corpses hanging from cranes as warnings, starvation diets, and brutal beatings. Von Braun visited the site frequently, inspecting the progress of production. Yet in his American dossier, these details were quietly omitted. Instead, he was celebrated as a visionary, the man who would one day guide the United States to the moon. His past was not denied, it was simply erased. Von Braun was not alone. Dr. Hubertus Strughold, later hailed as the father of space medicine, had overseen medical experiments on prisoners exposed to freezing conditions and low-pressure chambers to simulate high-altitude flight. Dr. Walter Schreiber, implicated in vaccine experiments on unwilling subjects, was relocated to Texas. Even Arthur Rudolph, a key figure in the Saturn V program, had supervised slave labor at Mittelwerk. When questions arose decades later, the official response was silence. By then, their contributions had become too entwined with America's triumphs to unravel without consequence. Declassified memoranda reveal the extent of the cover-up. In 1947, a State Department report warned that bringing Nazi scientists into the United States would spark public outrage. In response, the GIOA issued orders to sanitize personnel files. Documents were retyped, references to the SS erased, photographs destroyed. The goal was not only to secure the scientists, but to construct an alternate history in which they had been apolitical, unwilling participants in Hitler's regime. Entire narratives were invented. Men who had worn Nazi uniforms were recast as reluctant conscripts, their loyalty portrayed as pragmatic survival rather than ideological conviction. The truth was buried beneath layers of redaction. The Soviet Union, aware of the American efforts, launched its own program, Operation Osoaviakhim. In October 1946, Soviet troops rounded up over 2,000 German specialists and their families, transporting them under armed guard to facilities in the USSR. The Americans saw this as confirmation that their strategy was necessary. Each side justified its actions by pointing to the other, creating a race in which morality was abandoned at the starting line. In the shadow of the emerging Cold War, the choice was clear: secure the knowledge at any cost, or risk falling behind. The scientists brought to America under Paperclip were housed at facilities such as Fort Bliss in Texas, White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, and later, the Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama. They were given new homes, new identities, and the protection of American secrecy. Some integrated seamlessly, raising families and appearing at civic events. Others struggled with the language and the culture. Yet their expertise ensured they remained invaluable. The public was told little. Newspapers occasionally reported on former German scientists aiding US research, but the darker details were omitted. To speak openly would have been to undermine the carefully constructed narrative of justice and moral superiority. What makes Operation Paperclip so disturbing is not only the hypocrisy, but the deliberate suppression of truth. The Nuremberg trials condemned slave labor and human experimentation as crimes against humanity. Yet many of the men responsible for those very acts were quietly shielded, their records hidden in classified annexes. When survivors of concentration camps attempted to raise accusations, their voices were dismissed. Governments insisted there was no evidence, when in fact the evidence had been destroyed or locked away. Justice was sacrificed on the altar of technological advancement. The legacy of Paperclip is paradoxical. On one hand, it propelled the United States into the space age, culminating in the Apollo program and the moon landing of 1969. On the other, it left a moral stain that cannot be erased. The rockets that carried astronauts into the heavens were built on the bones of slave laborers. The medical knowledge that advanced aerospace physiology was derived from experiments carried out on unwilling victims. For decades, the public was fed a sanitized narrative, celebrating progress without acknowledging its human cost. In the 1980s and 1990s, journalists and historians began to peel back the layers of secrecy. Congressional hearings revealed fragments of the truth. Survivors testified about conditions in Mittelwerk. Declassified files confirmed the deliberate falsification of records. Yet even then, many documents remained classified, sealed under the justification of national security. The story of Paperclip was not fully told, and perhaps never will be. Too much was hidden, too much destroyed, too much invested in the myth of triumph. Operation Paperclip was not simply a program of recruitment. It was a pact of erasure, a forbidden agreement that traded justice for power. It demonstrated how quickly ideals can be compromised when survival is at stake, how easily history can be rewritten when governments decide that truth is expendable. The scientists who walked free, the victims who remained nameless, and the governments that colluded in silence together form one of the most disturbing legacies of the Second World War. Their story is a reminder that victory does not always bring justice, and that what is hidden can often reveal more than what is celebrated. Chapter 4: Hidden Massacres of the Katyn Forest. In the spring of 1940, while much of Europe braced for the Nazi advance, a quieter massacre was unfolding deep in the forests of western Russia. Near the village of Katyn, close to Smolensk, the Soviet secret police, known as the NKVD, systematically executed over 20,000 Polish military officers, intellectuals, and civic leaders. These were not random captives. They were the heart of Poland's leadership class. Doctors, professors, priests, lawyers, engineers, and decorated soldiers. The Soviet Union, having invaded eastern Poland in September 1939 under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, sought to ensure that the Polish nation could never recover. By eliminating its elite, Stalin intended to crush Poland's capacity for resistance, both during the war and in whatever post-war order followed. The operation was meticulously organized. Prisoners from camps at Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov were transferred in sealed convoys under the guise of relocation. Upon arrival at remote NKVD facilities, they were bound, gagged, and led into soundproof execution chambers. A single pistol shot to the base of the skull ended each life. The bodies were then dumped into mass graves pre-dug in the Katyn forest, their identities stripped away, their belongings catalogued and later destroyed. Soviet officers recorded the executions in chillingly bureaucratic fashion, noting the number of bullets expended, the time taken, and the completion of quotas. The scale of the killings required weeks of relentless execution work, carried out in shifts to maintain secrecy and efficiency. For 3 years, the massacre lay hidden beneath the soil. Then, in 1943, as German forces advanced on Smolensk, the mass graves were uncovered. Nazi propaganda ministries seized on the discovery, broadcasting photographs of skeletons in Polish uniforms, exhumed with hands still bound. They invited Red Cross investigators and international journalists to the site, presenting the atrocity as proof of Soviet barbarism. The evidence was overwhelming. Personal documents, letters and diaries dated prior to 1940. The decomposition of the bodies matched the timeline of Soviet occupation. Yet for the Allies, already tied to Stalin in the fight against Hitler, the revelations were dangerously inconvenient. Churchill and Roosevelt faced a brutal calculation. Acknowledging Soviet responsibility would fracture the fragile alliance holding the Grand Alliance together. Denying it meant participating in a lie. They chose the latter. Official statements dismissed the massacre as Nazi propaganda. Reports from Polish government-in-exile officials in London, who desperately pleaded for recognition of the truth, were ignored. In Washington, State Department files referencing Soviet culpability were quietly classified and buried. In London, Foreign Office memoranda use careful language, referring to the event as an alleged atrocity. Silence became official policy. The Soviet Union, for its part, maintained its deception with characteristic ruthlessness. They staged their own investigations, producing falsified evidence that blamed the Germans. Witnesses were coerced into signing false testimonies. Soviet publications denounced the Polish government in exile as collaborators with fascists. For decades, Moscow repeated the same narrative. Katyn was a Nazi crime, and to suggest otherwise was tantamount to treason. When the issue arose at the Nuremberg trials, Soviet prosecutors attempted to include Katyn as part of the indictment against Germany. Western prosecutors, aware of the truth, avoided confrontation. The massacre was quietly set aside, an unspoken compromise to keep Stalin at the table. The erasure of Katyn had profound consequences for Poland. Families of the missing officers were told nothing. For years they searched for answers, sending letters to ministries, petitioning Red Cross officials, and demanding recognition. Their loved ones were listed as missing in action, an ambiguous phrase that offered neither closure nor truth. Inside Poland, now under communist control, even mentioning Katyn became dangerous. Citizens who spoke of it openly risked imprisonment, surveillance, or worse. The graves in the forest remained a forbidden subject, erased from textbooks and official history, remembered only in whispered conversations and clandestine memorial services. It was not until 1959 that the first crack appeared. A secret memorandum from KGB chief Alexander Shelepin to Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev acknowledged the executions, recommending the destruction of all related files to prevent exposure. Yet the files were not fully destroyed. Some remained hidden, locked in the deepest vaults of the Soviet archives. In the West, meanwhile, declassified documents from British and American intelligence confirmed what had long been suspected. Both governments had known of Soviet guilt since 1943, but chose silence for political expediency. Reports from US officers in German-occupied Poland, sent back through OSS channels, included precise details of the exhumations and forensic evidence pointing to the Soviets. These reports were shelved, marked secret, and ignored for decades. The truth finally emerged in 1990, when Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, under pressure from Polish activists and the Solidarity movement, admitted Soviet responsibility. 2 years later, President Boris Yeltsin released the original Politburo orders, signed by Stalin and his inner circle, authorizing the massacre. Even then, the admission was partial, couched in vague terms, and followed by years of hesitation in offering full accountability. Russian officials oscillated between acknowledgement and denial, with later governments reviving old propaganda lines to shield national pride. For Poland, the delayed confession brought some measure of closure, but no justice. The perpetrators were long dead, the victims long buried, and the truth long suppressed. Walking through the Katyn Memorial today, one feels the weight of deliberate silence. Rows of plaques bear the names of officers, teachers, priests, lives extinguished not in battle, but in cold calculation. The trees of the forest, silent witnesses to the executions, stand like guardians over the unmarked graves. Each gust of wind seems to carry the whispers of the dead, their voices echoing across decades of denial. For families who lived through the erasure, Katyn was not only a massacre of lives, but of memory. Governments colluded to hide the truth, preferring alliances and expedience over honesty and justice. The massacre of Katyn is a chilling example of how history can be rewritten, how governments can erase truth for political convenience, and how silence can be wielded as a weapon. It was not only a Soviet crime, it was a Western betrayal as well, a decision to look away, to deny evidence, to suppress voices. The victims were buried twice, once in the soil of Smolensk and once in the archives of Allied chancelleries. Only decades later did the truth claw its way back into the light. By then, it was too late for justice. But the silence, carefully maintained, stands as evidence of how easily truth can be erased when governments decide that some mysteries must remain buried. The files you have heard are fragments of a larger story, pieces of a puzzle that was never meant to be assembled. Under the title 4 Mysteries Governments Tried to Erase from History, we uncovered atrocities buried beneath ash and silence, the experiments of Unit 731, struck from the record yet still influencing Cold War research. The betrayal of Operation Keelhaul, where human lives became bargaining chips for diplomacy. The hidden pact of Operation Paperclip, where justice was sacrificed for technological supremacy. And the Katyn massacre, where truth itself was executed and buried beside its victims. These stories are not simply relics of the past. They are warnings. They show how quickly governments will conceal, distort, or erase when the truth threatens their power. They remind us that silence can be as lethal as bullets, that archives can be weapons, and that history is not always written by the victors, but by those who control the files. As you leave these shadows, ask yourself, what else still lies locked in vaults, redacted in reports, or buried in forests where no one dares to look? Some mysteries remain sealed. Others, perhaps, are waiting to surface.